Hello everyone. Even though we have our own Rosh Hashanah, the Jews, but nevertheless, being that it's for many the end of a fiscal year, and whatever other way we count this year, so many people are off from work, or at least celebrating their freedom from labor. So it's a good opportunity to talk about something that people talk about all the time, which is New Year resolutions. And it's interesting when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, which we just celebrated a few months ago. There is no concept actually in Jewish thought about New Year Rosh Hashanah resolutions. It does say that when a new year starts, we have the opportunity to begin anew, and we have the opportunity to take upon ourselves new things. But the idea, the concept, which I think is a pretty modern one in the new age, new age, it's in the fast food generation that we live in, the idea that you can just take a resolution, and I think has a lot to do with the commercial side of it, which is called the self-help industry, that you can press certain buttons, magic tricks, and everybody's selling us different ways that you can start a new leaf, lose weight, or the other different categories of decisions we make. So I'm of the belief that, as many have pointed out, that the more you try to take on more new resolutions, the more you fail. Because it's far more complicated than just a day coming in the year and saying, oh, it's a great time to start something new. Very difficult to maintain any type of resolutions, because it's not about willpower, and it's not about just making a decision. It has to do with far more complex issues. So I thought it's a good opportunity to talk about this. And frankly, it's just an excuse really to talk about an issue which I think is universal all year round, and that is, in general, whether we are capable of change, period. If you take the Ecclesiastes tone, which is the book of Kehelet from King Solomon, and you read it ostensibly, it's actually quite pessimistic, that change doesn't happen. I mean, his classic lines include that a generation comes and a generation goes, ve'ein kol chodesh tachas hashemesh, and there's nothing new under the sun. And he repeats this theme many, many times. In more modern lingo, you have the expression, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, it's a good question to ask skeptically about ourselves or others. Do we really see change? I mean, the real change we see in our lives are mostly around the world of nature. Nature changes, goes through its seasons. There's a certain natural cycle. But human beings, the main change we go through is from childhood into adulthood. I specifically didn't say maturity, because you can be an immature adult too. And we go through, which is also a natural process. You're born, you're conceived, you emerge in this world, and then physically, physiologically, and neurologically, and in many other physical ways, we grow until we become this adult that you see when you look in the mirror, or when you are perceiving or thinking about yourself, which for most people is quite a number of times a day. So, but after that, the question is, can we really go through changes in our lifetimes? Now, when we're younger and more idealistic, we feel we can conquer worlds, we can dream, we can aspire. But then, when you reach a certain age, you start wondering, and you start becoming more resigned, and you start seeing that many of our dreams and many of our great aspirations haven't been fulfilled. You see a lot of people do more dreaming than actualizing. And some even develop a deep resignation, or even fatalism, that we really don't go anywhere. And the more you try to change, it's just a futile effort. Now, I don't know how all of you think about this, but I could tell you that even though it's very sad and even tragic for people to have given up hope, but from my little experience and what I've seen is, yes, I think as people age, they definitely give up hope. Nobody wants to necessarily state it quite that blatantly, because it's sounds too terrible that I've given up. It sounds like a defeat, a failure. But people start giving up, and it's harder to find that type of enthusiastic exuberance when someone is already hitting their 40s and 50s and so on. There are, of course, exceptions, and there are always times and events that everyone experiences that has a sense of renewal, perhaps new hope. The question is how long it lasts. So in other words, this discussion is not just some type of New Year discussion. It's really all year round. It's really about the essence of life itself. I talk about this many times. I mean, one of the biggest industries today is called therapy. Therapy. I don't know what the numbers are. I don't even know if anybody knows the numbers. But it's definitely in the billions of dollars. People go to therapists. How much, whether anybody's done a study of how much therapy actually works, obviously not, because a lot of therapy, as therapists themselves, will be the first to tell you, you can't measure its results. Some are long-term, some are invisible, some are arguable, some say there are results, some say there aren't results. It's one of those invisible areas where it's very hard to measure success. And it becomes a very personal, subjective thing. Some people fall in love with their therapists, which means they get addicted, and that itself becomes the industry. So not necessarily what the results are like, are just addicted to the experience. And it becomes part of a person's regimen, and they just fit it into their budget, even though they have far more bigger priorities maybe that are pushed to the bottom. And I'm not trying to be cynical or dismiss the whole industry. Clearly, if it's like anything in the United States, if it sells, I guess it has some value, at least perceived value. So in the United States, we say the customer is always right, even if the product is wrong. In Israel, it's the other way around. The customer is always wrong, even if the product is right. Which, by the way, is a good attitude if you ever go to Israel. But when you get off the plane, just think that you'll be able to handle a lot of the so-called cultural and social interactions there. So the reason I'm bringing it up is simply because this is one of the areas of our lives where people are going to help to another human being who's purportedly a professional, and different type of therapeutic models that exist to try to get to some control over their lives, some type of semblance, some type of peace, trying to resolve issues. And that would be a great place to measure and see whether people actually change, because here they're actually doing something. They're paying someone to help them get from here to here. Nobody's going to pay someone just to go back to where you began. So that would be a good thing. But unfortunately, as I just said, it's almost impossible to really get the data and objective data to determine. And of course, there's also the whole confidentiality thing. So that way, no one can even make a public study about matters like this, even without names. So I don't know if that's the way. That's maybe a tree not to bark up. So let's go elsewhere. So we go back to the personal, ourselves. And after all, a group of people is a group of people like ourselves. And the question is, do you believe you could change? If you don't think you can change, and I don't think I can change, and enough people think they can't change, so where exactly is change taking place? Now, obviously we have to go back to really take a Talmudic approach. You have to ask the question, who says we need to change? If you want to say, why are we even assuming that change is a necessity? I think that case can be pretty much made for that, especially for someone whose life is not working out. If relationships are suffering, if a person is lacking peace of mind, has all kinds of other stuff that's haunting them. So clearly a person like that will be the first to say, I need some change in my life. I need some improvement. To go a step further, even some of us who say everything is working out today and tomorrow, I think most intelligent people, a wise person who looks ahead, realizes that things don't stay stable. Life, even if things are very comfortable right now, it's a galgal hachazer, as they say. It's a turning wheel, like a Ferris wheel. Today you're up, tomorrow the wheel turns. I understand some people, if their economic situation is good, they're in a good mood. When the economic situation is not so good, they're not in a good mood. So in other words, it's really up to the fluctuations of the marketplace or what circumstances. And I think most people do not like to be dependent on these type of unknowns and uncertainty. We'd like to build something more secure, which is obviously one of the reasons, and a very basic biological reason, why people gravitate to finding a companion. Besides for sexuality needs and intimacy, there's also the element of creating some type of solid foundation, someone you can rely on, someone who can rely on you. Two people can complement each other and build something more than the sum of the parts. It's a pretty basic need. One of the real needs in it is security. And I don't mean necessarily financial security, I mean emotional security. To have something you can rely on. Besides a human being, also a home. A base. The Talmud actually says, in Yevamos, the Talmud says in two statements, one after the next, that a human being is not complete without a spouse. And then it continues, a human being is not complete without a home. And clearly these are two separate necessities, but it's part of the human condition because these things create security. And security, emotional security, is necessary for the well-being of a human being. Now, I'm not going to go on spend the rest of the evening making a case that we all can have better life than we have. I think most people realize that. The fact that you're sitting here, especially in this weather, means that you probably came to gain something that you don't have, or else why would you come here? You could have also stayed home and watched this on the comfort of your couch. It's called couch potato, and just listen and take it in. But I don't want to put any words into anybody's mouth. I'm not assuming anything. We don't assume anything. But I will make the clear statement that I think most human beings, even if their life is not working, they definitely want improvement. And if their life is working, there's always more. Healthy people do not suffice with today. Misha Yeshle Mana Reitzim Messiah, someone who has 100 wants 200, someone who has 200 wants 400. And as in Yiddish they say, if good is besser is besser. Which means if good is better, not better. Which basically is the human need, the human aspiration, the human restlessness to grow. So, taking that as a given, the question is, can we grow? Now, growth obviously on a very ostensible level, like financial growth, there's different vehicles that are offered to us. They're not necessarily secure, but at least you can figure out, you put money somewhere, hopefully you invest it, it can grow. The real issue here, obviously, I'm not talking about is on the material level, I'm talking about on the emotional level, on the spiritual level, psychological level. Are we hardwired? Is another way to put it. If you're hardwired, then a computer is not going to become an elephant. A leopard cannot change its spots, nor can a tiger change its stripes. Essentially two metaphors for the same idea. And can we human beings change ours? We have our spots and stripes, we have our habits and our routines, and we have, in addition to nurture, which comes through, let's call it acquired education, we also have our inherent, by nature, by birth, our genetic makeups. And as much as we don't like to hear this, but we are our mother's daughters and our father's sons, and we also are our mother's sons and our father's daughters, which means that as we grow older, often we become what we don't want to become, which is like our parents. Some people do want to become like their parents. I don't know if that's always good either, but however you twist it, the bottom line is, can we really escape these destinies? And how much can we really change? Even if we can perhaps change the background and the props and the names and the cities can change, but do we change beyond that? Is there inner change? So the question is pretty straightforward and requires, I think, a worthwhile discussion. So even if you've come to the conclusion that you don't think change is really possible, true change, but I think holding an open mind about this could be helpful, because it could be the difference between life and death, frankly. Because if you've given up on something and you find out that maybe you made a mistake and you shouldn't have given up, that can be a major factor. So, with that being said, I think it's a good way to also look at this whole discussion about all the resolutions people take. I look at the bestseller list every week in the New York Times. One reason maybe is because I'm waiting to see if Torah Meaningful Life will hit the list, but that's not really the main reason. The main reason is because I'd like to see what people are reading and what is considered a bestseller, like what the topics are. And when you follow it for a long time, I've not done any scientific studies, you get a sense. And basically in any list, you'll see that there's approximately, today they have broken it into e-books, and there's physical books, and now there's also another section called self-help and growth, personal growth. I'm not even sure how they define which is which category, but there's fiction, of course, and non-fiction. But you'll see on any list, check it out, there's going to be at least 20% of the books, if not more, maybe 30% are what we'll call in the self-help and personal growth category. Which clearly tells you that that's what people are looking for. Of course, there are other books on other topics, either timely topics, current events, scientific, interesting, controversial stuff, history. But this is a consistent genre, a consistent category. And obviously, don't have to be a rocket scientist to ask yourself, if this was like on the list for a year or two, okay, so there was a few self-help books people read, and now they've become better. So these books shouldn't sell anymore. Why does it consistently have 30% of personal growth? The only conclusion you could have is that it doesn't work. That's why the books keep selling. So another book comes out, another book. How many books can solve the problem? The greatest, I think, on the New York Times bestsellers. Remember, books like the Bible, which is actually the biggest bestseller of all, consistently, is not even on any list, which is interesting. The New York Times wants us to know the objective truth. They should at least qualify that, but they don't say that. The Bible is not even considered, but it's the single biggest selling book for the last thousands of years, but also now. Now, more Bibles sell a year than any other book, which also tells you something. But let's not consider that for a moment. You could argue then the Bible isn't working either. Why does it keep selling? And like, how many Bibles can a person have anyway? So I guess it's selling to new generations, maybe. Whatever, we can do an analysis on that. But these self-help books, the question is, Jeff, just make sure that the sound is on. Yeah. The question is, are these books working? So the one that hit the record, if you all remember, was the book called The Road Less Traveled. Maybe none of you are old enough to remember this book. Came out in the early 70s. I mean the 1970s, not the 1870s. The 1970s, The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck, who himself was a pastor, and then he wrote this book called The Road Less Traveled, and I think it was like something like 700 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, which is an enormous amount of time. That's what is that, 12 years, more, 15 years? What is it? We talk about 52 weeks a year, so okay, you can do the math. And interestingly, they did some studies and asked how many people, since it's such a bestseller, it sold millions and millions of copies, how many people bought the book, read the book? And they found out not many. After a while, people buy it because they say it's the book to buy. So that's another interesting phenomenon in the United States. If everyone's doing it, people do it. Which is why you have sometimes lines out of the clubs. It's not because there are people inside. They just keep the door locked, so it should look like there's a line. And because it creates demand, supply and demand, right? So if you can create the image of demand, people respond. Now, another statistic I read, I remember where, but the book begins in Scott Beck's The Road Less Traveled begins with the following line: life is difficult. That's the opening book. And they actually asked people, what do you remember about the book that was so memorable? Your book is selling to so many people. And everyone talks about the first line, life is difficult. Did you read anything after that? No. So they bought a book just to find out that life is difficult. It resonates because it's true. You read that and they say, wow, I didn't know that life was difficult for other people too. I thought it was just for me. That's a revelation. That's an epiphany. There was another big best-selling book recently called The Purpose-Driven Life. So this was written by Rick Warren, right? And who's making a comeback lately. He's one of the evangelists of the mega churches. These 25,000, 30,000 people that gather in Saddleback Church, like in California or in Texas. So his opening line of the book, you're wondering where I have the time to do all this stuff? We all got a little free time. So my research showed me that his opening of his line of his book is, it's not all about you. Which too resonated with many people, and that was it. They didn't necessarily need to read more, which is true. You could live if you knew that life is not all about you, you got the secret to all problems. And then, of course, there's the rest of the book. So, you have to start wondering, this whole industry called self-help and personal growth is clearly touching a nerve because people want personal growth. They want to grow. They want help. That's undeniable, and I would not say that, I wouldn't dismiss that at all. That's a very important thing, that these people are aware that they need assistance. The question is whether, however, all these drugs, quote unquote, and all these medications and all these remedies, whether it's books or in other forms or techniques, are working is another story. Which would really be the question would be, after all these books and all the technology that we have today and the access to therapy in every possible way, is the standard of our psychological and emotional lives higher than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? I think most people would argue it's not. So then, clearly, these books are either not providing the techniques, or even worse, the mere fact that people think that there are books that can help you is maybe the worst problem of all, because they think that the solution lies in that, and that takes you away from really finding the real solution, which is obviously where I'm leading to. Now, I'm not coming here with the type of fire and brimstone approach. I'm not doing a book burning evening where we're going to burn all self-help books. It's not my objective. I believe I'm of the thinking that the best way to fight any battle is through spreading light. You know, if you, the greatest challenge to life is not is the vacuum. You have to always have an alternative. To tell somebody this is not a remedy is not a solution. You have to tell them what is an alternative so you can replace it with. That is a lasting solution. So solutions are people who say this doesn't work, that doesn't work. That's fine, but then what do you leave people with? Then they're left without anything, without any crutch. So the best solution is to find an alternative, a healthy alternative that both resonates and above all works. So I think the best place to look is what I would think any scientist would go to, or any researcher, is what's most time tested, what's been around for the longest time. Well, one thing that's been around, the specimen A that I will present here, is the Jew. We've been around for a long time, and to the chagrin of many nations and individuals, we've lasted. One of the first questions the Dalai Lama asks any Jewish visitor that comes to see him, the Dalai Lama, who is known as the leader of the Tibetan Buddhism, and actually a fine person, I met him myself, the first question he asks most Jews, is, what is the secret of Jewish survival? Now, he says very up front why he's asking the question, because he's obviously facing this big dilemma that his nation, his people, are in exile, including him, because Tibet is controlled by the Chinese, and he's in exile, and he's concerned whether he will be able to preserve the philosophy that was with them for whatever the millennia, the thousands, hundreds and thousands of years, I don't know, whatever the amount of time that culture has been around. And where best to look is look at the Jews, because they're the oldest culture of them all. In one one continuum is the longest. Now, obviously we have to also qualify, just because we're here for so long doesn't mean necessarily we're healthy, but we have survived. And you have to say there's something about longevity that makes you have to look at it. And the interesting thing is the Jews do have a book, it's called the Bible, the Torah, and just like any constitution, it documents rituals and documents episodes and history and commitments, documents a whole game plan. So even if one wants to dismiss and say that's not relevant to me, but if you want to see if something works, the most important thing to see is if something lasted. Something lasted, you have to wonder what made it last. And trust me, I'm the first to acknowledge, and I sort of say this all the time here, even though some people do not like when I say it, is all the flaws that exist in the Jewish establishment. But you can't deny that in the Bible, whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, it's a book that documents a promise. It's basically a covenant. It's called the Bris Bein HaBesarim, the main covenant. A promise that God makes to Abraham that your children and grandchildren will one day prosper and spread out all over the earth. And the two examples that are given consistently are this, like the stars in heaven, or like the grains of sand on the beach. And we look today, in the year 2012, despite all odds, despite all the obituaries written and all the predictions, it's true. The promise was fulfilled. So as I said, even an unbeliever cannot deny this book was definitely not written yesterday. It was not written 100 years ago, no matter what theory you go with. Even people who do not believe that the Bible is divine, who could have known that such a promise would be fulfilled? What were the odds? The astronomical odds that a man who lived in Mesopotamia almost 3,800 years ago would actually have a child, and that child would have a child, and that child would have a child. And in every instance, if you look at the stories, like any one of them could have been killed any given moment, and that we would be here today. What are the odds for that? Almost impossible to imagine. What are the odds that we were even here after the Holocaust just 70 years ago? Read newspaper accounts in 1945. And legitimately so. They called and they said by the year 2000, which means 55 years from the end of World War II, there will be no Jew left on earth. Now if you go with a pure scientific and logical approach, it sounds right. If out of 18 million Jews, 1/3 were decimated, And that 1/3 were, many of them were leaders and teachers and rabbis and scholars. Not only were they decimated, but the whole culture and the whole over 1,000-year history of Jewish life in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and so on was wiped out. Who would imagine? In America, assimilation was at its greatest heights. There was no country, there was no Israel. Who would imagine that just a matter of years between assimilation and so many leaders and so many communities wiped out, there's no way that this could last. Not that we don't have our challenges, but no one would believe a renaissance that exists today. You just go to Israel. It doesn't even matter what persuasion you're of. You cannot deny certain things. It's unbelievable. And I'm not talking about our spiritual status and our healthy status. We can be as dysfunctional, but we're here. You go to Russia, a place where for 70 years the communists actively and aggressively wanted to stamp out everything that's Jewish. There's a renaissance there. Still doesn't mean it's touching every Jew. Obviously, millions and millions. I mean, they have a 50% intermarriage rate and so on. So, not like things are great, but no one would have imagined that it would have survived. So the question is how. So we could dismiss it or not dismiss it, or simply say it's a miracle that we can't understand, and that it's God's hand, it's God's people. Because many people say this, even anti-Semites, some of them say that. Like Dennis Prager likes to remind to say about anti-Semitism. He has a good analogy. He says, why is it that the Jews are hated for this idea called chosen people? You go to a country like, for example, Japan. Okay, they call Japan the land of the rising sun. Why? Because the children are taught that the sun rises in Japan first and then everywhere else in the world. Did you know this? Now, it's true. The sun rises everywhere first. When it's in that country, that's where it's rising first. But they say it rises there first and then the rest of the world. Okay, fine. So they're pretty much a Japan-centric world. Japan is the center of the world, and the rest is just an addendum. In China, they teach the same thing, that we're the center. The United States went with the policy of manifest destiny, this country of manifest destiny, a God-chosen promised land, a new promised land. So why is it that no one's ever bothered by that and goes to kill Chinese or Japanese or Americans because you think you're superior? See, when it comes to the Jews, they claim you feel the chosen people and they kill us for that. So his interesting answer, which I happen to agree with, is very nice. He says the reason is you don't kill them because you don't believe it. Let the Japanese think that the sun rises there, big thing. Comes to the Jews, the people actually believe it. The Nazis actually believed it, so that's why it bothered them. You're not bothered by someone decides, your little baby comes and says to you, I'm the center of the universe and nothing else exists. You smile and you give them a candy and go right, you go further. But if you believe that it's possible, then you become resentful. Anyway, not here to pull rank, but when Zhou Enlai was the prime minister of China, when it opened up, when Nixon visited China in the early 70s, so Chinese culture, which was an ancient culture, first time Western journalists had an opportunity to speak to the Chinese. So they asked the Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai, they asked him, what does he think? What's his opinion about the American and French revolutions? You know what his response was? He said, it's too early to tell. Okay? Because it's only 200 and 250 years old. What does it compare to history? I hear from people who do business in China that the Chinese do not respect anyone except Jews because of longevity. Because they understand. A company that's been lasting for so long, we know in advertising they say brewing beer since 1876, or we're selling furniture for 70 years. People, it registers, you can trust these people because they've been around, they're time tested, trial and error, they figured it out. Even though frankly most of these companies have changed hands many times, they don't belong to their families. But it elicits, you can trust us, we've been around since then. So we can say we've been around for 3,800 years at least. That's Abraham. You go to Adam and Eve, it's a little more. So the case I'm making here, that there's something to look at, maybe the best kept secret in history. And I will tell you, the Torah is all focused about this one question. Can a human being grow? Can a human being change? Is there hope for mankind? Because clearly, a very strong case could be made, and I'm using now another Jew, his name was Sigmund Freud, which dominates in many circles, especially Western thinking about the human nature, human psyche. And the case is made that we are no different than any creature on earth. And just like a leopard cannot change its spots, so too we cannot change ours. We can fake it, we can control it, we can discipline. But push comes to shove, the human being is a creature of habit, is a creature of a social animal, and that's it. And just like we don't prosecute animals for being predators, no matter how vicious they are, a human being has elements that there's no way you can change. This is a very prevalent psychological perspective on human beings, which frankly has affected everybody. I don't think anybody on earth, in the Western world at least, has not been infected by this approach. Even, by the way, people call themselves ultra-Orthodox Jews. Because even though they're insulated, but when it comes to psychological attitudes, like everybody, they pick it up from everywhere. And that's why we have such dysfunctionality in all circles. So what does the Torah say about this? So of course, we all know the Torah talks about Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, which in simple psychological terms is that we have two voices inside of us. One is selfish and one is giving. It's the simplest way to put it. I don't want to use good and evil because good and evil are meaningless words. What does good and evil mean anyway? Let's talk more on a personal level. It's either selfish, narcissistic, or selfless, or giving. You're either going to be a giver or a taker. And that fact is we're both. We have two voices. You can determine which voice dominates. But we definitely have two voices. In any given situation in life, which are you going to be? Some of us are educated from our childhood and from our education and from media and from the world. You take care of yourself because no one else is going to take care of you. You need to be selfish because everyone else is selfish. This is a very common attitude. And many people, they're honest and just straightforward. They'll tell you that's how it is. Dog eats dog. I was once maybe a more giving person. Then I see everyone just takes advantage. I don't want to be taken advantage of, so I'm just going to swim with the sharks and be another shark just among them. And if you ask that person, so what do you do with that whole sensitive side inside of you? I just shut it up and I just, I reserve it for my family. I reserve it for moments when someone's really needy. But in this world, you got to be tough because if you don't have your fangs up and if you don't have your defenses and armor, it's a war. Life is a war, and you got to be always prepared. Life is a battle. Life is difficult, and if either you're going to be consumed or you're going to be the consumer. Predator and prey. Simple as that. I remember right after September 11th, a guy used to come to this class, came to me literally hysterical. He worked in the financial district, and he was always envious of who was he envious of? A friend that worked in the World Trade Center, one of the big firms, who that day was killed. And he say, I used to pray that the guy should be hurt. He was envious because they were in the same class together, and he made it more. And then of course, when he was killed, he had a lot of feelings about this, and he came to realize, what is he worshiping? You see this all the time. I hear this. People confide in me. Most people don't talk about it openly. People work especially in the very competitive industries, in finance, in law, and so on. Especially when you're young and up and coming, the pressure to succeed causes you to compromise many of your values, causes you to compromise friends, because you're competing with the guy sitting right near you, who may be your best friend, for the next raise, for the next upgrade. What are they called? For the next promotion, right? And that's how it is. And when you read, I don't want to quote him because I'm not his chassid exactly, but he had it right. Also, another Jew, Karl Marx. Not Groucho Marx. Well, Groucho Marx said this, talk about values. He said firmly, I have my set of values, and if you don't like them, I have another set. So there's another Marx called Karl Marx. I don't know if he was a Meshuma, whether he was a convert or his parents were a convert, but bottom line, he's got Jewish blood for sure. You could see it from his ideas. So he had a utopian dream that didn't work. It just simply wasn't viable. But many of his scathing critique on economics, especially capitalism, are very accurate. And one of them, he makes the case for alienation, that capitalism alienates people from each other because of the competition, from the product. Most of us don't even have benefit from any product. We're working for a product that's being sold elsewhere. Alienation between boss and worker. Alienation from you and yourself. So as much as he was an atheist, but his ideas are very spiritual. As a matter of fact, to be a little mischievous, I once delivered a paper in England, in Cambridge, about, it was called, there was a conference there about affluence and spirituality. And my topic was wealth and religion. So I did a lot of research on wealth, religion, the role of wealth. Is it a contradiction? Is it not? Capitalism, socialism, charity, the Jewish view. We know the socialist view. We know the capitalist view, etc., etc. So one of the things I came across when I was doing my research was a little refresher on Marx. So there's Marx that was also made Marx Light for the public, and then there's Marx in his original writings called the Paris manuscripts, before it became more popularized. So he writes in his original writings, I found something very interesting. I decided I'm going to test the crowd, and I read a quote from there. I didn't tell them where it's from, and I asked, who do you think said this? And the quote went like this. The quote said that when you're at work, you're not at home. When you're at home, you're not at work. That your soul is completely alienated when it goes into the workplace, because it has to deal with the outer world and producing and all that. That was the gist of it. And I asked people, who said this? The interesting answers. One person said the Baal Shem Tov, the Kotzker Rebbe. Everyone had Abram Joshua Heschel. It's coming from me, so they thought it must be some Jewish scholar. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Everybody had their thought. The Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Lubavitcher Rebbe. Anyway, then I tell them, well, you're all wrong. It's a Jew, but it's a different category. And brace yourself. His name was Marx, not Groucho, but Karl Marx. Everybody was pretty shaken because they didn't think he would use the word soul, or they would use the home and work. And the truth is, what he says is exactly biblical. The Bible says that Adam and Eve, not eaten from the tree of knowledge, Adam would not have to go and earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. He could be focused on his spiritual growth, on divine spiritual growth, and he would be provided for. Work did become a force of alienation. That now most of our day we're spent on the means, not on the end, which itself is an interesting distortion. Now, why am I saying all of this? Because when you look at the Freudian and Marxian and Darwinian, just to throw in all everybody into one pot, I don't know if they'd be appreciative if they're all on the same pedestal, but from my point of view, it all leads to one thing: that this world is a narcissistic world, and figure out how to make it work. It's true, Marx did try to introduce a more utopian version, but it failed miserably, because even though he claimed that let's all have one collective pot, it ended up creating more abuse of individual power than any capitalist system ever did. But bottom line is that this viewing mankind as being a selfish creature, or to use the words of one of our own resident atheists, Richard Dawkins has a classic book called The Selfish Gene. Now, he's a radical atheist, as fundamentalist as religious people are religious. He's a fundamentalist atheist, just as crazy and radical. Obviously, it sounds even more bizarre when you're an unbeliever to be radical, because where do you get the radicalism from? But I guess he's responding to the other extreme. So, one guy once got up and said he loves to have extremists because that's the way we know how to travel the middle of the road. You know where the edges are, so you know where not to go off. So they keep they keep us honest. So you have the two extremes, and you stay more or less in the center. As the Rambam says, always choose the middle path, unless you've wandered too far one way or the other. And she has this book, The Selfish Gene. The case being that biologically and scientifically, we are wired as selfish creatures. And when you look at bacteria, you look at any specimen, any species, any organism, it's all driven by one rule. The cardinal rule is, I must survive. And I will do whatever it takes. I will eat up your resources. I will eat you up, if necessary. I must survive. And if there is altruism and giving and benevolence, it's because it's also selfish. This is classic, hardcore, what they call social Darwinism. Some say Darwin never meant to say that. He was talking specifically, purely natural selection and stuff like that. But the way we look at the world today, it's more or less like that. On the other hand, you cannot deny that we live in a far more humanitarian world than we've ever lived. And I'll just use basic examples. When was it? Around a year ago was the earthquake in Haiti? Right? Around a year ago. Look at these natural disasters. And what happens? All the countries in the world gather together, spend enormous resources just to help a country that's not their own. This is unprecedented. Look at the history of Greece, of Rome, of other great countries that once lived, once existed, empires. If there was a natural disaster, what did all the countries do? They raped and pillaged that country, and they stole all its resources, and that was it. They conquered it. So to have a world that, instead of doing that to a helpless country and help them, has to be acknowledged. So I know that Dickens wrote, these were the best of times, they were the best of times and the worst of times. But I think in our world, the paradox is even more intense. You have a tremendous amount of narcissism, but you also have a tremendous amount of giving and benevolence. Even if it's for ulterior motives, but it's still there. You can't deny it. There were ulterior motives in all of history. Not all ulterior motives translated into benevolence. So when you address whether we can change, we really have to address is, what are we wired to be? What does the Torah say about this? And the interesting thing with the Torah is that, number one, nothing is simple. And that's what makes it simple, when you acknowledge that. If you try to simplify things that are superficial solutions, you end up just usually causing more damage than good. So there's a simple formula. And it's basically based on the principle of why are we here? Why are we here? Because God, for whatever reason, whether we can understand it or not, is another discussion, desired to place a human being, as the Bible says, it created a divine image, into a world that is antithetical to that image. Simple as that. And it's given to us, given to human being is charged with a mission to realign and reconnect to that image. So essentially, you have a divine soul, you have a divine mission to do something with your life that is absolutely immortal, but you're put into a mortal world with plenty of challenges, to the point that you can convince yourself that you're a selfish human being. And yes, we do have two voices. The first, most dominant voice is stated in the first chapter in the Torah. Human beings created b'tselem Elokim. You are the divine image. No matter what happens, you are always going to be that image. However, that image gets concealed like anything does. A newborn child, young children, are the closest thing to the divine that you'll ever see. Just like they're the healthiest when they're healthy. They use their lungs, their bodies are healthy, they're flexible, they're enthusiastic. That's the purest version of you. I know today in technology it works the other way around. Version 1.0 is usually the worst, and 1.1 and 2.1 and 5. Is getting better. But that's man-made objects. When it comes to humans, I would say it's the other way around. The earlier you are, the more pure it is. And then we accumulate toxins, and we accumulate dust, and we accumulate, just like our arteries harden, our psyches harden. And we start losing hope in ourselves, not because it's not there, is because the eternal spring of hope within our souls becomes concealed. And we become hardened, just like we don't use 100% of our lungs by the time we're age 20, or even younger. We also don't use 100% of our souls. We're not as mobile, we're not as idealistic. And yes, we become products, I would say even worse, victims of a materialistic world, of the blind leading the blind, and it becomes a vicious cycle of self-fulfilled destructive prophecies of doom. That we're dying creatures, and it's just a matter of time. So grab what you can. No one's going to take care of you. That attitude I described. Essentially a narcissistic attitude. Now, there are narcissists that know how to camouflage themselves looking very sweet and nice in suits. And there are narcissists that don't know how to masquerade. That's really the key distinction. But most people are living a life about me, me, me. But there's another voice inside of us, which is, we know we're not satisfied with that alone. So some of us, to satisfy the conscience, also have some of our so-called benevolent. We have our charities. We have our volunteerism. But if anything, it's usually an addendum. There's me, and then I have a few things to satisfy that other side of me. When in truth, from a Torah perspective, it's the other way around. You are fundamentally a giver. And you've become a taker because you've become insecure, and you've seen everyone else take, so you've become shaped by them. You're no longer yourself. So essentially, when we're behaving narcissistically, even though paradoxically it sounds like, oh, then I'm really taking care of myself, you're actually the farthest from yourself when you're narcissist. You're the closest to yourself when you're a giver. That's classic Torah philosophy. And that's why, look, you may feel more pleasure, may feel more pleasant to take, but in the long term, it never feels as good as to give. what was it? The guy in the Frisco Kid. He robs the whole train, and then before he jumps off the train, he takes everybody's jewelry and money, and he says to them, "Remember the lesson of life." He's the thief who took everything. He's telling them the lesson of life. He says, "Remember, it's always better to give than to take." That's where the Ganef went, and then jumps off the train with all their stuff, which happens to be true. That doesn't justify what he did, but that's another story. So, understanding human nature is the critical component. I would say we make our biggest mistakes in trying to change because we don't understand ourselves. Imagine you convince yourself that you're a frog, and then you want to change it. And then it takes 100 years, and you find out, someone tells you when you're 80 years old, you know what, you're not a frog. You say, really? Interesting, I spent 80 years trying to change myself, and I didn't even know who I was. So before we talk about change, maybe the first question is, who are you? Maybe there's nothing to change. Maybe you have everything you need, and maybe the other way around. Maybe you got to get rid of the things you added on. Very basic. Now, if that was stated, I guarantee you wouldn't have self-help books on bestseller lists. Because once you've developed that, you wouldn't need to read another book. No one has to sell you anything. Because that's exactly what the Torah says. And I'm cutting through all the things. If you look at the basic principles of the Torah, I'm giving you no commentary. This is not Kabbalah, it's not mysticism, it's not Hasidism, I'm not talking halacha now, Jewish law. I'm talking about biblical text without any commentary. What's the first description of a human being? In the Bible, that's the biggest bestseller, as I mentioned, and that we're still here 3,800 years. What's the first description of a human being? You think an intelligent human being, an emotional human being. How would you describe? If you were asked to give a elevator pitch on a human being, you have 30 seconds. Tell me, what is a human being? Most people would say a thinking creature. Some say a social creature. How would you describe it? Guarantee you're not going to use the Torah's description because we don't think that way. The Torah's description is B'Tselem Elokim, which initially sounds cryptic, but if you think about it, you know what really Tzelem Elokim means? The image of God. I'll tell you what it means. The simple English. It means it's not man-made. That's the first thing. That's all you need to know. I'm not now going into the meanings of Tzelem Elokim. There are volumes written. But one thing it's not a man-made product. How many non-made products do you know? Almost all of our lives are controlled by man-made products. Except one thing, you. You're not man-made. Your parents didn't create you. They may have produced you, but they didn't create you. Like the joke with the scientist that is arguing and saying, I don't believe in God, and he tells God, you don't exist. How such a dialogue can take place in the first place is another story. Whatever, the imaginary God, you don't exist. And he makes a statement, he says, you know what? You created a universe, I could also create. In a laboratory, I can also create a life. And what does the scientist proceed to do? He tells God, you'll see, I'll create a life. And God says, go ahead. He takes earth from the ground, he's about to take it. God says, no, use your own earth. Yes, I understand. It's called yesh mi-yesh. If someone gives you something, you can reshape it. But why don't you shape it in the first place? So life itself means you and I are the only thing that's not man-made. You can't buy a child in the store. Thank God. So even if we don't know what God is, but we know one thing, it's not man. Once it's not human, it's not subject to human terms. Which means that before you start talking about whether we could change or not change, maybe find out what you are. That would be the first statement. I told this once to a scientist I know, who's a real fatalist. He feels everything's predictable, everybody's selfish, no one's going anywhere. That type of thing. And I asked him, you're a scientist, I understand, when you observe phenomenon, before you make any come to any conclusions, don't you first study its properties? Yeah, absolutely. I said, tell me the properties of this human being that you're talking about before you tell me it's doomed. What do you know about the human being? And it was interesting. He didn't know much. He knew about himself, and he knew about the mother he hated. That's about it. I said, there's 7 billion people on this earth. And I'm not trying to dismiss his conclusions, but he was taken aback because yes, he's a scientist, he's a chemist actually. So chemistry, yes, he knows how to take apart something and give you its chemical makeup. But a human being, before you talk about someone being doomed, you got to first define what the thing is. And most people would be hard pressed to define a human being because we don't really know. We know far more about outer space and things that are happening millions of miles away than what's happening right here. Think about it. You surprise yourself all the time, right? How often? Tell me how many times a day you see something, you have a choice to make, and your mind tells you this is absolutely wrong, and you do it anyway. Has ever happened to you? Well, explain to me this creature like that. That makes sense? But a computer says, here are all the conclusions, and then does the opposite? That doesn't make sense. Right? But we do it all the time. I would say we do it most of the time. We're emotional creatures, we're paradoxes, we're bizarre, we come to conclusions, we make full of contradictions. That's a human being. Now, I'm not saying that's who we are at heart, but it just tells you how confusing it is. Frankly, I'm more confused about me than about anything I know. You start looking at yourself, some things make sense and some things don't. I don't know if you share these sentiments, but if you have yourself figured out, great. I'd love to hear more about what you think a human being is like. So the Torah, in its humility, makes the statement very clear. It's not man-made. It's a divine image. It's something greater than you'll ever imagine. Now comes the next step. What will you become? You'll become a product of what you think you are. And most of us become a product of what others impose, what others project, what our parents think, and then what society thinks, and or what our schools think, and what our teachers think, and what our friends think. And at some point you ask yourself a question, no matter who you are, am I a product of me? Of the divine image I was created, or am I a sum total of a whole bunch of different messages and signals that I've gotten that are controlling what I do? How we dress, who we please, who we don't please. People who are pleasers are being shaped by those that please, and people who are defying others are also being shaped by defying them. So you start wondering what decisions that I make. What's the last decision you made that was really yours and yours alone? Can you even know? So the first emancipation, the first freedom, is asking this question. It's not even important whether you come to a complete answer. If you're not ready to ask this question in honesty and with integrity, you're going nowhere. You can have all kinds of people giving you all kinds of tricks to have a happy life and a better life and an improved life. If you don't know how to ask this question, you're not going very far. And if you do ask this question, the interesting thing that happens is certain parts of yourself start emerging. Because you start realizing, yes, there is a part of me that I don't even know. I've never seen. Since I was talking some of the so-called negative sides of therapy, well, whatever I said, I don't know if it was negative, let me tell you the positive side of it. The best therapists out there, the best counselors, the best coaches, whatever name you want to give them, Jews call them soul doctors. Once upon a time, a rabbi was a soul doctor. Not an administrator, not a witch hunter, not a guy who decides which restaurants are kosher or not a fundraiser, not a politician. A rabbi was a soul doctor. You've heard of this concept, a soul doctor. Not a witch doctor, a soul doctor. He was an expert on a soul. Moshe Rabbeinu was an expert on souls. That was his main strength. He wasn't just he knew the legal laws, that was one thing, but he knew what a soul was because he knew what God was. He spoke to God face to face. He discovered what a divine image is like. Someone spoke to Moses. They found out about what they're really like. You probably didn't hear that part. Because Judaism and Torah is not just about laws. Laws are just the mechanics. There's a soul behind it all. The Zohar says there's a body of Torah, there's a soul of Torah. There's a body and there's a soul. Most of us our lives are controlled by the mechanics of our bodies and its needs. And the mechanics of a material world that tells us whatever it tells us. When in fact, your driving engine is your soul. That is the essence of the entire Torah. Which is why he says in Tanya, for example, that the biggest mitzvah of all, what's the biggest mitzvah of all? This is one you're not going to find kanoim. You know what a kanoy is? Zealots. Radicals. If people call themselves radicals, they're kanoim. But here's one mitzvah that happens to be the biggest mitzvah in the Torah. You're not going to find many people call themselves zealots. The mitzvah is called Avos Yisrael. Loving to love another person. I've always wondered, even as a kid, I used to say, all these fundamental religious people were all religions. How come nobody ever chose the cardinal mitzvah of all to be a fundamentalist in? And to be uncompromising. This is the one everyone compromises when they pick all kinds of other less foundational mitzvahs to be called radical about. So what he explains in Tanya, why is this the foundation of the entire Torah? So the story goes with Hillel, that Hillel was approached by a potential convert, and he said to him in the tractate Shabbos in the Talmud, and he said to him, teach me the entire Torah standing on one foot. So Shammai, who was a more stricter teacher, dismissed this fellow, said, you can't teach someone the Torah standing on one foot. It's ridiculous. He came to Hillel, who was more gentle and more lenient, and Hillel said to him, which in Aramaic it means what you would dislike, what you despise, do not do unto another. Zui kol Torah kula. This is the entire Torah. Ve'idach perusha zel gemara, and the rest is commentary. And go study. So he asks in Tanya briefly a very fundamental question. It's a beautiful story, very powerful. Mada'olach soni is essentially the negative of v'ahavta, meaning love your fellow means don't do anything and others that you don't want done unto yourself. They call the golden rule. But the question is very obvious. How could Hillel say this is the entire Torah? Half of the Torah at least is ben adam lamokim, our laws between you and God. The laws between man and man, yes, you can say all fit under the umbrella of Mada'olach soni. Not don't do unto others you don't want done unto yourself. Don't love another. Love. But the mitzvah like Shabbos, kashrut, prayer, the offerings in the temple, the laws of purity and impurity. I mean, there's hundreds of laws that have nothing to do with you and another person. So how could Hillel say this is the entire Torah? He doesn't say it's part. He says kol Torah. And then the question the other way around. We see many people who do all the mitzvahs, and they're not more loving human beings. On the contrary, some of them are actually more hating human beings. They're more judgmental, more condescending, more negative, more angry, dogmatic. I should throw that in also. Good word for this purpose. So what's going on? What is Hillel saying exactly? And then you have people who don't technically do mitzvahs, and they're very loving. To really just fill out all the questions here. The Tanya only asks the first question, but the same question can be applied. And his answer is brilliant and simple. In just a few words he basically says to understand the statement in the Talmud, Hillel's words, you have to understand the nature of love, the true nature of love, and the true nature of Torah. If you know the answer to those two things, the whole question disappears. The true nature of love, he says, is what he calls it, is when a person makes his soul dominant over his body. Two people whose bodies are control and not their souls cannot really love each other. Because two bodies will clash. They may be at times will have mutual interests, but ultimately materialism by definition divides. My piece of food is not your piece of food. The only reason that two people can love each other and transcend their material differences of time and space is because they have a soul, and the soul is more important to them than their bodies. So true love is based on a spirituality. Two stones can't love each other. They don't hate each other, but they don't love each other. No relationship. Two human beings, for a time of true relationship, requires something that is more than just their physical entities. That's statement number one. So that's the true nature of love, is transcendence. And the true nature of Torah is what? Transcendence. The Torah was not given to give us laws to follow. The Torah was given to teach us how to transcend our material, selfish lives and transform it into a refined, selfless human being. And even Shabbos and kosher and the laws of purity and the temple and the prayer and everything I mentioned before, even between man and God, yes, the law is between man and God, but it's about you elevating yourself to God, not God bringing him down to your image. Not creating a God in your image, but creating a human being in the divine image, aligning the human being to the divine image. Every mitzvah. That's what Hillel said. That a mitzvah equals love, equals transcendence. Every mitzvah. And if it's not doing it, there's something fundamentally wrong. So if somebody is doing mitzvahs and they don't see any more love, a monkey could also be trained to go through motions. I don't mean to be so harsh. A mitzvah is not just an act. It's also about refinement. Now, are there mitzvahs like charity and others that you can do without any intention? Yeah, of course, it's acceptable. But there's some that you cannot do without kavanah, without the right intention. And all of them, even tzedakah, when it's done with a good heart and a smile, is a far higher level. The whole point is refinement. And if a person who eats kosher is not kosher, the major problem, a major dichotomy is taking place. And finally, regarding people who do mitzvahs, who are more loving and they don't have mitzvahs, of course the obvious answer is that if they did the mitzvahs, they'd be more loving. So the point is, right here in these few statements, you have a whole radical view different than most people will take. No, most people will not say Torah equals love equals transcendence. That's not the way we usually think. Most people say the Torah people I know are the least tolerant, the most condescending, the most judgmental, and they're the people that are most obnoxious. That's what most people on the street will say. As sad as it sounds. And unfortunately, it's hard to contradict them because they happen to be there are some numbers like that. Is that the Torah or is that people? That's the difference. You don't judge a system by the people, you have to judge it by the system. But on the other hand, like many good friends of mine say, that's very nice of you when you say that, but if there are no people following the system, what's the system worth? Which is why Chil Hashem and Kiddush Hashem, desecrating God's name and sanctifying it, are the biggest mitzvahs of all. Because I can tell you right now, sitting here with a beard and a yarmulke, and I travel around and I speak primarily to secular audiences. I don't really deal with the so-called the experts in Judaism who are already godly, quote unquote. So when I'm out there, they say, yeah, we know you guys like you. I have to deal with stereotypes all the time. So you can have many people who are looking the part and dressing the part, but it's not like what they say, if you quack like a duck and you walk like a duck, you are a duck. It's not correct. There are people that can look very, what they call Orthodox Jews, and they're not at all. Because what defines Judaism? Since when are garments defined? I would say Avos Yisrael is the biggest mitzvah of all. So whoever's the biggest lover is probably the most religious person on earth. That's what we have to be looking for. But since when is that the standard? So clearly it was hijacked. And these are not my words, the Torah says it. Rabbi Akiva says, Zeklal Gadol B'Torah. Hillel says, is the foundation of the whole Judaism, etc., etc., etc. And unfortunately, it's much easier to become a cultural human being, and culture is what shapes most people today, not faith, not God. You can have a religion without God, and you can have God without religion, sadly. Judaism really, in its full form, in its full glory, is a fusion of ritual and spiritual. But today, in this world today, you'll find that Americans, 90% or more will say we're spiritual, we believe in God in some way. Only 40% will say they're religious. Which tells you, very simple, that religion is seen as ritual and not as spiritual. It's missing the SPI before the ritual. Which is very sad to me, because that's the whole basis of Judaism, I understand, is a fusion of body and soul. Yes, there actually is ritual. There are acts. It's not just a meditation. It's not just sublime ideas. There's a real system. But what's mechanics without a soul? And that, unfortunately, is one of the key challenges of our time. So to go back to the question, can we change? To go back to the issue of who we are, the Torah puts it quite simply, you're born in the divine image, and after that it's usually downhill. But it doesn't have to be. Healthy parents would do best if they gave their children the most spiritual type of education possible. Now, what does spiritual education mean? Spiritual education means not just trained to wash your hands in the morning and say the blessings and do all the other rituals. That's all beautiful customs. But if it's lacking the soul, we're in for trouble, especially in our times. It also means to put your child to sleep, and when they wake up in the morning, tell them that there's what a God means, and that they have a soul that's waiting to be released. And when they grow a little older, they have a mission that they were sent for in this world, and the mission is not to make money and give charity, and not to just take care of your material needs and once in a while do a nice thing. It's your whole purpose of your life, why your soul is here, is to change the world and spiritualize it in some way. Imagine if children heard this message every day, hundreds of times a day. And the mitzvahs are the tools to do it. So what we have today, a world, is either we have people, the minority, that teach their children the traditions and the rituals, but they forget about the soul, or you have people who don't teach either of them. So you end up having, what do you have? You have human beings that become victims or products of our society. Yes, so then we do become selfish genes, and we become driven by whatever satisfies our whim, and we do become narcissists. And we are directly responsible, because we ourselves are narcissists, and we're shaping people in our own image. So the Torah is saying, God said, I created you in my image. Don't create your children in your own image. That to me is like the first mitzvah of all. And then there's another voice we have. Yes, there is a voice. The next chapter in Noach, he talks, Ki Yetzer Adam Ramenu Urav. The first place the Yetzer Hara is mentioned is in the second chapter. After we know that a human being is at the core, quintessentially, we are divine, then we have another voice inside of us that is selfish and can be very selfish. But that's not your course you. That's not your core you. That's a superimposed state. For most of us, it's the other way around. The natural voice is the selfish one. And once in a while, we have some divine inclination, if you can call it that. Michelangelo, when he's once asked, and I've shared this because it's, I think, a very beautiful way of putting things. It was actually a compliment I received once, one of the nicest compliments. A few years ago, before Rosh Hashanah, I received this note from a woman who was living in Seattle. She had a terrible year, she writes to me. And she first lived in Austin, Texas, went through a horrible divorce, horrible year. And she ended up here. She said, one of the rays of hope, the only ray of hope I had was once a week when I received your weekly emails. Gave me hope. I always knew Thursday night or Friday morning I could wait in my inbox, had some message that gave me hope. And I want to thank you after this year of the hell I went through. This was one ray of hope. Then she concludes and says, I'm a sculptor by trade, by profession. And I want to quote Michelangelo, maybe the greatest sculptor of them all, when he was once asked, how do you carve these beautiful statues, these beautiful angels in the marble? How do you create them? Like, what's the secret to create such beautiful images? And his answer was, I see the angel trapped in the marble, and I carved and set her free. That was his answer. So she writes to me, so thank you for setting my angel free. That's why I said it was a beautiful compliment. Because it is the greatest thing that a teacher could do, that a mentor could do, is not give you anything. It's to help carve away the exteriors, the outer layers, the dust that gathers, that doesn't let you see yourself, that doesn't let you see your own image for what it is. Michelangelo understood the beauty was in the marble, it wasn't in him. His brilliance was he was able to cut away. So we all have an angel or a flower or a musical note. You can use any metaphor you like, embedded in you. That's what it means, the divine image. It's not just an esoteric term. It means you are fundamentally a beautiful creature, as you were when you were a newborn child, undeniably then. And then layers begin. Some of the layers are marble, some are concrete, some are other substances. Not all are mentionable. And we have this beautiful child, this beautiful force, this beautiful music trapped inside of you. How many layers? Who knows? I don't think it's even possible to figure out, because they have to go through your whole life, every experience. But it's not hopeless, because the angel doesn't disappear. A soul can't be destroyed. You know why? Because no one built it. The law in science is you can only destroy something you build. You can't destroy something you didn't build. Your parents didn't give you a soul, so they can't take it away from you. No one on earth gave it to you, so they can't take it from you. All they can do is lock it up. All they can do is make you think it's not there, intentionally or not intentionally. Every time we're invalidated as children, every time we're not nurtured, every time you're not reinforced, another layer is added, and you start doubting yourself, and you develop fear, and you develop insecurities, and you develop all kinds of these mechanics that make it difficult to make real decisions in life, and you're fearful. You keep watch over your shoulder, who's going to take advantage, etc. And then when we get older and we're a little hopeful and we fall in love and something's working, and then we get disappointed, the layers start climbing again and say, listen, I tried it, it's not working. We give up. And the list goes on. Everybody's got their script. And the challenge is to know this fact. That's the first thing. You must know. It's not even a question whether you can carve away the layers. You must know with absolute confidence that that child in you, that beauty in you, is never destroyed. Period. Why do you think one of the key things why Judaism rejects Christian theology? Above all, one of the biggest things, and the distortion is, because the big distortion is the concept of original sin. That when Adam and Eve sinned, it became a force of evil that controls our lives, and the only way you can free yourself from it, the only salvation, is believing in a certain Jew, which I always found quite comical, if not ironic. because I know Jews. I happen to be one. They got it wrong. You don't believe in Jews. That's not really the great thing to do, But that's what they decided. Whatever, maybe whether that was a marketing conspiracy 2,000 years ago or whatever, who knows. But the bottom line is that Judaism rejects this concept. Yes, that we can sin, absolutely. That we can make mistakes, transgressions. But nothing can destroy the divine. There's no force in the world that can destroy the divine force inside of you. That's sacrilegious and denies the whole concept of what God is all about. Because like I said, God is the only thing that's not man-made. So how can man destroy God? It's God that creates us in His image, not we create God in our image. But we're always creating gods in our image. Most people's perception of God, frankly, is a human perception. So it's not only when you build a golden idol. Every time you think of God on your terms, you're already creating a God that fits your personality. But that is a somewhat of a tangent. To go back to the point here is, so the question is, how do you build this confidence in yourself? And that's the secret to all growth. You don't have this confidence, there's no possibility for growth, because you're going to get messages all the time. There's an assault on our psyches telling us the exact opposite. You cannot do it. Who do you think you are? You're no different than anyone. So it needs a pioneering spirit, but it needs a belief, almost to the point of mishugas. Mishugal Yesidover, they say, insanity. To believe yourself, and now in yourself in that way. Now we have many examples. You look at anyone that was a pioneer, from Steve Jobs to Henry Ford to Einstein, you'll all hear the same thing. Whenever they ask Steve Jobs, what kind of market research did you do? You know his answers to that, right? Market research. He says, people don't know what they want. Why would I ask them? Which is like sacrilegious. The whole business is built on market research. They spend billions of dollars just to find out what customers want. Ford, who was not necessarily a great friend of Jewish people, but he said, when they asked him that same question, he said, if you ask people what they want, they'll say they want faster horses. They're never going to say they want a car because they couldn't even imagine it. A faster horse. So, what Jews have inside of them is the absolute confidence, and that's why we're here, is that this indomitable spirit can never be destroyed. Not Hitler, and not Stalin, and not all the others. They couldn't destroy something like that. Pharaoh, the first of them all that we'll read about in next week's chapter, made the cardinal error. What did he say? His stargazers told him, listen just to the story and you'll hear the whole secret of Jewish survival. And I have no problem exposing it, because go ahead, let somebody replicate it. You'll see how it's impossible to replicate. So it's not a trade secret. So Pharaoh, they say that joke, they say, there's an expression, siyag l'choch mishtika, which means, like, I guess, a support or the way of the wise is silence. So they ask the question, so once you expose the secret, the trade secret of being wise is to be silent, then even stupid people will be silent and everyone think they're smart. So the answer is given, stupid people, even if they hear the secret, they don't know how to do it. So it doesn't make a difference. You can tell them the secret, it's not going to help. Either you know how to do it or you don't know how to do it. Either you are a chacham or you're not. You can't fake it. You can't fake that. So the same thing here. The trade secret is simple. Pharaoh, his stargazers tell him that one day there's going to be a little boy who's going to grow up to be a man, and he's going to be a Moses, he's going to save the Jews. So Pharaoh is brilliant. Simple solution. Kill all the boys. So he makes a decree that every Jewish male has to be thrown into the river Nile. That should solve the problem, right? But it didn't solve the problem, because yes, he killed many males, but the wrong ones. He didn't kill the right one. Thank God. Because what did the women do? So there was an argument then. The men said to the women, the Jewish men said to the women, they said, you know what? Let's stop having children for now, until this decree is over. This madman is going to kill every second child, or he's going to kill every male. Not that they didn't love their daughters, but they said, this is crazy. And the women responded that if we don't have children, who's going to get out of this God-forsaken place? God promised us we're getting out of here. We're going to have children, we'll figure out what to do. And it says, the Talmud says the women went to the fields and they bore their children there. Yocheved, right? You know the name? Yocheved went and built a little basket, put her little boy Moses in there. His name was not Moshe yet. That was a name he would get soon. And she put him among the reeds in the sea, the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. Sent his older sister Miriam to watch. And that's how he was saved. And then the daughter of Pharaoh found him there. And she gave the name Moshe, Minamayim Mishisiu, etc., etc. So,
It was in the Nile, not in the Reed Sea.
You're right, I'm sorry, the River Nile. Yeah. Among the reeds in the Nile. Correct. Now, I hope that doesn't mean that everything else I said is absolutely right, or else you would have caught me on that, right? Okay. Right? Correct. So, the question is, what's the story behind the story? The story behind the story is this. Pharaoh made the mistake like everybody makes a mistake. It's called, what they call in psychology, projection. He thought that the power of the Jewish people lay where? Who's could be his enemy? Men. They're brutal strength. They can bear arms. Who's going to challenge his great army? What he forgot, thank God, was the power of spirit. He didn't realize the women's willpower. The women are not a threat. The women and children could always be subdued. That's what every army knows. But he didn't realize the power of will. The power that they will have children anyway, and they'll figure it out. And they'll be ingenious. And he couldn't contend with Yocheved's little chokhmah, wise idea. She put a little boy in a basket, and Pharaoh's, all his decrees were meaningless. And across the board, you'll see every enemy, they can only destroy what they think is the enemy. They can't destroy what they don't understand. That's what I said. Either you have it or you don't have it. They could not destroy spirit. I remember this. It's always. Everybody's shaken, of course, by the Holocaust. Whenever you hear about the brutality, the dehumanization, let alone the genocides and the murders of children, and, it could have been any one of us for no other reason, simply because they were Jewish. So it makes all our blood boil. But I've always, one of the things that bothers always beyond imagination. You hear the stories how Jews went to the gas chambers and they said Kaddish. And they sang Animamen even. They sang a song that they believed with complete faith. They said Shema. And you have to ask yourself, at that moment, it wasn't darker than it could be in history. You saw things that no one should ever see. God was as concealed as it gets. So they had the full right to be quite angry. Quite upset. Definitely not be praising God's name while this is happening. And yet they had this presence and strength. So, so if you want to be flippant, you could say, okay, they're fanatics, but we know Jews are pretty smart people. There was something going on here. So I once asked this question to a Holocaust survivor, and he told me, he said, nonchalantly, I asked it, respectfully and very humbly, I didn't mean to challenge, just want to understand. He said, you have to understand, when everything's taken away from you, what remains is who you really are. Your core essence, because there was no comforts, there were no homes, there were no bank accounts, there was nothing. You had nothing left there. You didn't even have your life left. You didn't have your family. Nothing was left. Your dignity. And he said, the Jews would not go down as losers. They said, you can take everything from us, but one thing you're not going to take from us is our faith, and you're not going to take from us our hope. That if it won't be us, it's going to be our children. And if it won't be our children, it'll be our grandchildren. And we will survive. Maybe not us in bodies, but our children will be here. So that was known. Every Jew there knew that. They didn't know how to say it. It was just a given. I heard that. I was like, it's awesome to hear that. God forbid, tragically, you should never have to be tested, that everything would be stripped. I remember this class. I don't know if you were there. It's at least 10 years ago. More. This class, not in this, we were at another location. It was, if you remember, it was one of the first terrorist attacks in Israel. It was a Friday in Ben Yehuda. There was by a cafe, by a table, a bomb blew off. It was one of the first ones. It was before it became, unfortunately, more common. But I remember that. Do you remember that story? It was not. It was no, before even Sabaro. One of the early ones. Anyway, it was a pretty tragic thing, and it was a lot of people. So a little while, around 6 months later, a woman comes to this class. She was sitting in the back. And I remember noticing her. I saw something I wasn't really clear what it was. Then at the end of the class, she and her friend came over to speak to me. And I got closer. I saw her face was clearly there was some cosmetic something going on there. She had a beautiful face, but I saw it was like reconstructed, lack of a better way to put it. And I remember she started to me very openly. She said, I was there in the cafe when that bomb exploded. I was an American girl coming to study there in school, and I was waiting for a friend. I happened to be in the wrong place, and quite a number of my friends, others were killed, and for me, basically my face was blown off. I don't have hearing in one ear, my other ear very little. I have no sense of smell anymore. What you see here is reconstructed by Israeli cosmetic surgeons. And I don't know why she was sharing. She just shared it with me like this, and then she said to me, "And I'll tell you what was even worse. My parents didn't know I was in Israel because they were secular, and I told them I'm traveling to the what she said, somewhere to Europe, not Europe, somewhere to Asia. I guess you could say Israel is part of Asia. So because they wouldn't like if I went to Israel to study, and they saw me for the first time in bloodied up on CNN, and they came flying right away because they recognized me." She says, "Why would God do something like that to me? I was lying in the hospital. I was hoping to die. Why didn't you just take my life? Why do you leave me without a body, without a face, without my senses? I came to study Torah here, and this is what happens to me." She was so angry at God. That's what she tells me. And this was months. And she said, I was in a delirious state. I had to be medicated because of the pain and so on. And I would go in and out, always, every day asking God, take my life. Then she said, I don't know what happened, but several months passed. One morning I woke up with this very surge of willpower that I'm going to live. And these are the words she said to me. I'll never forget the words. She said to me, you don't know what faith is until you have nothing left but faith. Now, coming from someone like that has credibility. I say it, many of us say it, it's nice words, it's a nice cliche. That's what she said. You don't know what faith is until you understand, when you have nothing left but that. Now, God forbid, none of us should ever be stripped to that point. But I say to myself, you go to the Holocaust, and obviously this is not in any way, I'm not looking for any silver lining, God forbid, but it's unbelievable, the spirit. That a guy tells me this, he says that we could die, but our children will continue. And I was in Berlin a few years ago, Hanukkah, and I was in that gate there, Brandenburg Gate, whatever it's called, where Hitler, Yamach Shemay, stood with hundreds of thousands of his legions. You have the images. Right there, Hanukkah, there's a big Hanukkah menorah where Hitler stood. And when I asked the Rabbi Techtel was there, Chabad Rabbi there, I said to him, how'd you get the Christmas tree to the right? He says, it used to be in the center, but I told the guard that a menorah looks more centralized, it fits more here. So he got the menorah sticking in there. The Jew got it figured out. And you have little Jewish boys and girls running around, and I see them in the streets of Berlin, to the chagrin of quite a number of Germans, I can tell you, today too. To me, like every Holocaust survivor, they'll tell you, that's our revenge. They open up a photo album. Here are my 30, 40 grandchildren. This is my revenge. We don't blow up cafes. We're not looking for blood. Our revenge is the spiritual survival, and we will not go down. And if there are grandchildren of Nazis, they're not advertising it. And the Jews are here 70 years later, and we march. Because the spirit, because they always knew, the soul cannot be destroyed. Now, it shouldn't have taken that. I will never understand the Holocaust, and I'm not in any way trying to explain it. But this lesson is a tremendous lesson, because we live in the let's call it, the other side of the spectrum. It couldn't be more comfortable. I understand we have a recession, and we all got our little issues, and we don't know whether we're going to watch this show tonight or that show tonight. We've got our dilemmas. But come on, let's not kid ourselves. With all our challenges, one day there you can't even imagine. So the question is whether we can reclaim our spirit, our divine image. And to me, that's the ultimate secret. It's not about resolutions and fast food tricks or whatever, quick buttons. It's understanding that you have what it takes. You're an angel, and nothing can destroy it. And history is a testimony to it. And I would say, in a strange way, the people there who were stripped of all those comforts, in a way it was easier for them, because we have the complacency that comes from prosperity. There's an expression, Vayishman Yeshurun Vayivat. You know what this means? That when Yeshurun, which is a name for Israel, gets fat, with comfort, is prosperous, Vayivat, they begin to kick, they become arrogant. Someone suddenly hits the gold mine, he thinks he owns the world. It's far harder challenge to deal with the apathy and complacency of comfort and prosperity than it is to deal with oppression. But we don't want oppression, we're not asking for it, we're not turning the clock back. So I find that the challenge today is to understanding that part inside of you, and it's not easy, because there's an active assault on our soul every second. Not deliberate, I'm not a conspiracy theory guy. The material world by definition is conspiring against your soul every second. your bodily desires, your physical needs, the material world. There's narcissism of a selfish, insecure material world that knows it has nothing but to hold on to, except its own ego. The soul never had this problem. The soul is a very secure force. It does not need to hold on to hoard, because it's secure in its own right. It doesn't need to. You don't need to be wrong for it to be right. There's that second story they tell about in the Holocaust where this guy was about to be killed by this particular sadistic Nazi. He asks him, he says, "Before you kill me, can I say something?" So he starts mumbling, starts saying a prayer. And the Nazi gets furious, says, "What are you saying?" He says, "I'm thanking God." "You're thanking God for what? Are you thanking God?" "Exactly. Look at you, miserable, wretched Jew, I'm about to kill you. You're thanking God?" He says, "I'm thanking God that He didn't create me like you." Tell the story. Whether true story or not true story, it's a good story to tell. It resonates. So, I'm using strong examples, but I want to bring it back to where we are here today. Thank God we're blessed in many ways. We don't have to worry about anyone watching us coming to study here or speak or pray or send our children to any school. There's no one waiting outside to inform on us. Yeah, our challenges today are mostly man-made, frankly. They're mostly, actually, our own worst enemy is ourselves. Our own perception of ourselves, who we hang around with, what we do. But we live in a heavily, heavily material society that is constantly projecting and inundating us with messages that actually undermine the true divine image that you are. The true music, the true angel, the true beauty, the flower that you are. And to me, that's the key. You regain that connection, and everything else becomes far easier. Now you'll ask me, how do you regain it? Okay, well, we're sitting here. Number one is we strengthen each other by talking about it. There's no better way to cultivate a flower is by watering it, by giving it attention and saying, I know you're there and I'm going to water you on a daily basis. So being around people that reinforce this message again and again and again is critical. Because the other message is always going to be there waiting for you to consume you. The second thing is to figure out in your own life how you can cleanse your life. I don't like the word cleanse maybe, but maybe you got to relook at what you have in your house, what messages, maybe how much television you even watch, and what shows you're addicted to. I know these are not such easy things, because it's easy to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to take on a new resolution, I'm going to become a better person. This year I'm going to have hope, I'm going to find a shidduch, I'm going to get married, or I'm going to be a healthier human being, a healthier husband, a healthier wife, a healthier parent, whatever it is. That's all nice and good, but what happens if while you're deciding to do that, you also have toxins being fed right into you? So you could have all these resolutions, but you have a whole series of things that you've not let go of that are just weighing you down. So that would be what they call tevel v'sheretz b'yodeh. You know this expression? Persons immersing themselves in the mikveh, but they have in their hand basically a force that makes them impure every second. So it's like, like the kryptonite thing. If it's making you impure, you can be immersing yourself all day in the mikveh, but you have a force that your toxins are poisoning you. What's the first thing they do when they bring somebody into an emergency room? God forbid. The first thing, you can't administer it to the person. You have to first clean the person up. You have to stop the bleeding, so you can isolate and see where the problem is. There's no way you can create a future if the past is perhaps haunting your future. So it's like, I'll eat great food, but while you're eating great foods, you're also breathing poisonous air. So it's like the key thing to look at your life and see, what do I have in my life? It's called, in Hasidic terminology, it's called tshuva tata before tshuva ilah. Before you bring new furniture into a new house, you want to vacuum the floors and make sure the dust isn't there, or else the dust is going to just defile your new furniture. So you can have great new ideas, new resolutions, but it's being haunted by the past. So simply, maybe it's a good time to do a little spiritual bookkeeping and figure out what's going on with your life. Now trust me, this is the most painful part. Who wants to look at their life? Most people don't even like to look at their books. You hire an accountant tells me that most of my clients don't want to hear what I have to tell them. So I say, and they pay you for, he says, yeah, and they pay me for that luxury. They pay me, I should know, and I shouldn't tell it to them. Because they don't want to hear about all the mistakes they make. He told me, a guy made mistakes, doesn't want to hear that he made a mistake that cost him $3 million this past year. He wants me to couch it. So basically he's going to make the mistake again. Yeah, but the fact that he has me makes it feel like he's not really dealt with his problem. It's like the guy says, how's your husband? He says, my husband makes me sick, and then he takes me to the best doctors. You know? So the point is that you have to look at your life and look at the thing that's hardest to look at is what are you doing on a daily basis? Maybe you're feeding toxins into your life. So I'm making a new resolution right now. Since a lot of people come to me for counseling and discussions, I'm going to ask them this question. It's a new question I'm going to put on my repertoire, and that is if they're ready to make a little spiritual bookkeeping, which means they don't have to do it with me. Let them find someone and make a list of what they do on a daily basis, and see if they're ready to subject themselves to an objective, trusting friend to see if any of the things they're doing are not feeding toxins into them. So what's the point of giving you good advice when I'll give you the good advice? You may even do the good stuff, but there's a whole bunch of other things that are feeding all kinds of poison into you. Now, I don't believe in cold turkey solutions. You can't just change your life. It doesn't work that way. Everything is in small steps. Tafasta meruba le tafasta. Ma'at agarshenu is the expression. You want to conquer something, you do it step by step by step. It's like climbing a ladder. You can't climb 10 rungs. One foot up, the other foot still in the lower rung. So you have to really look at two things. You have to include some new habits, new good things in life. You bring light in, there's less darkness. But you also have to sometimes, unfortunately, look a little at what you're doing. Because you may be canceling it out. You may be bringing something good in while you still have a lot of dust. So I think it's about balance. I'm not talking about some extreme change. But the first thing is some type of sober and honest look at all of this. Now, the thing I just realized was that if everything I said here after this evening doesn't solve anything, so I'll be culprit in the same old thing with the best-selling books. Everybody's listening to the ideas, and everyone's still the same. So now we got ourselves a little into a pickle here. So this is now you're responsible to whether what I said is true or not. Because if you don't do anything with it that works, then I'll just be another one of those statistics of another guy dispensing and pontificating self-help advice that's not working. And you'll come back. So it means next week you shouldn't be back here because all your problems should be solved. But that doesn't mean I don't want to see you. Just trust me. So anyway, do what you wish with that. That was just a little self-deprecating, whatever, humor. But it's good to hear some feedback. So if you have any thoughts on this, please let me know. Well, what I want to conclude and leave you with is this. Obviously, as a Jew, I will tell you Rosh Hashanah is when the new energy enters the universe. I don't think anything is going to happen when the ball falls January 1st, a few days from now, besides the yells and screams and the fireworks and whatever people do. You know, of course, the new fiscal year opens for many and starts 1/1/13, etc. Credit cards expire, all the other stuff that has to be done. So I don't know, beyond that, I don't think anything spiritual is happening. But from my point of view, whenever there's an opportunity, people want to, New Year's, they think of it as a new year. Great, so it's a good juncture to talk about some of these ideas. But above all, is to understand the message is this. You, every one of you, is extraordinary. Period. You are a soul that is unique. No soul like you has ever existed, and no soul like you will ever exist on this earth. If that's not the most strongest message, then I don't know what more a person can say. That's what you are told, that's the truth. Everything else is commentary. What you're going to do with that is now up to you. But you have a soul. No one can replace you. Nobody can do what you have to accomplish in this world. And the question is, are you living up to what your mission is? Your soul was plucked out from heaven, from spiritual realms, and sent to this earth on a mission. And tell me what you think, whether you think you're doing your mission or not. Unfortunately, most of our day is busy with means. And most of our response to that was, even without hearing you, I can tell you, most people say, what am I supposed to do? I have to make a living. I have to get up tomorrow to do a job. I wish I could sit down and spend time on what you're saying on this mission. But think about what you're saying. If, in other words, the primary mission why you're here, you have no time for. What does that say? I'm not trying to say this to make anyone feel guilty. On the contrary, it means that your greatest beauty is not being accessed because you have so many distractions. So how do we begin? You begin by small steps. You have to connect to this concept and begin to bring it into your life. Find a way where it begins to seep in. This is not about quantity, it's quality. It can be once a week, it can be once a day. You start thinking about it. And trust me, you stick to this attitude, you will change your whole life. you'll change what you're doing because you start realizing what's a priority and what's secondary, what's means and what's an end. Now, it's not easy to do for one reason. We have a force called habit and routine. I don't know how to measure it, but the force of habit and routine, I can tell you, is probably 1,000 times stronger than any of your resolve that you have. Because it's cumulative years of doing something, the same thing again and again. So if you're able to weigh it as a strong man, it's like going into the ring with someone that is 1,000 times your size. Is there any hope? That's the power of your routine. Your routine carries unbelievable weight because it's simply your routine. The status quo is not as neutral as it sounds. It's a powerful force called inertia. So you need a force that's more powerful than that. The only force that's more powerful is not resolve. It's the soul that preceded the routines. See, that's the key. It's to go back to a power that before those routines, there's a soul inside of you, like Michelangelo said, there's the angel. These routines are layers. So they may be very powerful, but they can't be more powerful than what you were born with. So their power really lies in your perception, how much power you give them. If you give them power to control you, then they control you. So now the question is, can you find the right friends and the right reinforcement of who you really are? And then you have a formidable chance to deal with routines. And if it's done step by step with a plan, strategy, not aggressively, but step by step, like drop by drop, like Rabbi Akiva learned, drop by drop by drop, that pierces the stone. Any cold turkey, any type of cramming sessions, these don't work. It's consistent. Kviyas itim l'teir is the word. Every day, a few minutes is more powerful than accumulatively more 1,000 hours a week. One time. I mean, that's a lot of time, 1,000 hours. Are there even 1,000 hours in the week? Let me strike that. What I say is, a few minutes a day is more powerful than a bunch of hours at the end of the week, and it's all crammed in. Is the consistency, is the persistence, that's what fights the routines. And what you have going for you is that you have a flower and a powerful divine image, which is the real you. That's the driving force. So, with that said, I wish upon all of you that angel, that flower, that music, that extraordinary soul that you have should finally begin to blossom. Blossom more than it's blossomed till now. Let's put it that way. And illuminate and affect the world, your corner of the world, with your unique music and your unique beauty in ways that nobody else can do but you. Now this class is dedicated to the loving memory of Chana Bas Shmuel, 23rd Yartzeit, this Shabbos, 16th of Teves, by our loving daughter Yocheved, and also a refuah shlema for your brother Rafael ben Chana, and maybe quick and speedy recovery. And since we're talking about souls, everything we've learned here and we discussed here is definitely the merit of the soul of Chana. What year was it? About 23 years ago. Well, every year in the Yartzeit it says the soul goes up another level, but also sends down more power to those that are here below. So your mother should give you power. As I said, every generation carries the baton, so you are now your mother, basically, and with all the strengths and powers, like we started, the midges that stand on shoulders of giants, and may her neshama empower you and all of us that have studied in her name tonight, and it's also preserved forever on the cyberspace to access the real soul that we are. And here in bodies and healthy bodies, we should have many, many healthy years to be able to fulfill the mission through illuminating the world with the light of Torah and mitzvahs. And everybody here should, as I said, have the power and the courage to access and to live up to your pioneering contribution. And we shall continue this journey together as we enter next year, 2013. We'll be here. And please stay in touch, Mircha Hashem, of course. But Kol Yisrael b'cheskas kashrus, and if any I could help to help you discover your angel, please know that I see this as my mission, and so stay in touch in every possible way, including by email or whatever other contact information. So until next week, I bid you all a very beautiful night, a beautiful year, and a beautiful life. Thank you.